Today is Sunday. It's July the 24th, and the title of today's devotional is The End, but Merely the Beginning. Our scripture reading, Malachi chapter 2, chapter 3, and chapter 4. This devotional will conclude our chronological study of the Old Testament. Tomorrow we'll begin anew in the New Testament. But for today, Malachi chapter 2, 3, and 4. Now you're going to notice as you begin reading Malachi chapter 2 that the focus of the prophet is on unfaithful priests as it continues from chapter 1 into chapter 2. Now those priests were guilty of accepting inferior sacrifices and sacrificing them, though they knew they were a violation of God's law, chapter 1 and verse 7 and 8. Well, the prophet confronted the priests, and he accused them of despising the privilege of the priesthood. In verse 1 and 2 of chapter 2, Malachi warned the priests the Lord would curse them, for they had not served from the heart. In verse 2, he says, "Ye do not lay it to heart." In a graphic portrayal of God's disdain for their hypocrisy, the Lord warned in verse 3, "I will corrupt your seed and spread dung upon your faces," the dung being that which was from the burnt sacrifices that were left on the altar. Now, notice, if you would, verses 4 through 7. It was the duty of the Levites to live righteous lives and to teach the people the law. And yet, as you look at verse 8, there were many of the priests who had led the people astray, causing them to stumble. They had corrupted the law, and God warned he would cause the people to despise the Levites and the priest. Now, in verse 11, particular condemnation was directed to those men of Judah who were guilty of divorcing their wives and taking heathen, idolatrous wives in verse 11. Now, those men were hypocrites. As you look at verses 12 through 13, they continue to come and offer sacrifices, and Malachi warned those men, "You will be cut off, and your sacrifices will be rejected." Now, some men came hypocritically to the altar with sacrifices and tears, weeping. But the prophet warned, "The Lord regardeth not any offering any more, or receiveth it with goodwill at your hand." Hypocritically, they dared to ask, why? Why does the Lord reject our sacrifices? Well, in verse 15, Malachi spared no words in condemning them, the men, for they were guilty of violating the sanctity of marriage. Verse is 15. Rather than rejoicing in the wife of their youth as they should have, and honoring God's design for a husband and wife to be one flesh, those men had divorced their wives. Now, tragically, as you look at verse 16, we realize that today believers and our churches, sadly, have followed that same pattern of wickedness. And today in the church culture, divorce is commonplace. Well, Malachi declared God's heart on the matter of divorce. As you look at verse 16, he says, "For the Lord, the God of Israel, hateth putting away." The putting away there is the word for divorce. Why? Well, verse 16, "For divorce is as violent to the spirit as tearing a garment." You see, divorce is an act of treachery against God and one's spouse. Now, here's a warning in verse 17. "And it is that God will not hear our prayers, nor receive our praise when we are hypocrites in actions, attitudes, and words." Now that brings us to Malachi chapter 3. There are really two great prophecies that we find in Malachi chapter 3. The first one is found in verse 1, where we read the prophecy of a, quote, messenger the Lord promised to send. And that was fulfilled by John the Baptist, the forerunner of Christ, the Messiah. We also find a second prophecy, and it is the prophecy of the first coming of the Messiah that is described as the messenger of the covenant. Indeed, the message of Christ in his first coming was a message of God's love, his grace, and his mercy. And yet, as you look at verse 2 and 3, the Messiah, Jesus Christ, will come again. And remembering that prophecies carried an imminent application and a far-reaching implication, the Lord likened the second coming of Christ in verse 2 and 3 as a fire of judgment. In fact, we read, for he will be like a refiner's fire, like a fuller's soap, a picture of purifying and cleansing. Well, in Malachi 3 and verse 5, the sins of the people were recorded there. For we are reminded that God, though, is immutable, gracious, for he assured Israel in verse 5, fear not me, saith the Lord of hosts, for I, the Lord, I am immutable, I change not. And therefore ye sons of Jacob are not consumed. All of their sins and the wickedness that we find in Israel deserved God's judgment, but God was long-suffering, patient, and merciful. Now Malachi also, as you look at verses 7 through 15, he confronted two other sins. One was the sin of robbing God of his tithes and offerings, verse 7 and 8. And then as you look at verse 13 and 14, the people were denied they had done wrong and complained against the Lord with hard or stout words. They complained there was not profit in serving God, saying it is vain to serve God. Now that brings us to Malachi 4 and really this closing passage of our study of the Old Testament. We find here a prophetic message in Malachi 4. Malachi 4 and verse 1 foretold the second coming of Christ is a day of fire and judgment, and all that do wickedly shall be stubble when Christ returns. And yet, as we look at verse 1, that the wicked have reason to fear the coming of the Lord. As you look at verse 2, believers who fear and revere the name of the Lord will greet the Son of righteousness. Why is that? Verse 2, because he brings healing and blessing. And Christ's future coming is described as a day of rejoicing. And in verse 2, the calves are pictured joyfully coming out of their stalls and leaping for joy as a picture of rejoicing. Well, in that day, in verse 3, when the wicked who have persecuted the righteous will themselves be judged, and they shall be as ashes under the soles of the feet of the righteous. Well, a closing thought for you. The Old Testament Scriptures concludes with a promise and a warning. The Lord promised the day would come when he would send the Old Testament prophet Elijah, whose coming will precede the second coming of Christ near the end of the tribulation in verse 5. Elijah's ministry would not only announce the coming of the judgment of the Lord, but also the healing of the homes of God's people. For we read in verse 5, for he shall turn the hearts of the fathers to the children, and the heart of the children to their fathers. Well, our study of the Old Testament began in Genesis chapter 3 with the sin and the fall of Adam and Eve, the first man and the first woman. Our study of the Old Testament now in verse 6 concludes with a warning that prophesied the second coming of Christ and his judgment. For the curse of sin will not be removed from man until Christ comes again. Thank you for joining me for this study. Tomorrow we begin our study of the New Testament with Luke chapter 1. God bless. Have a wonderful day, and bye-bye.